March 1945. Just outside Remagen, the world erupted in steel and fire before dawn. American Shermans thundered through the river fog as German panzers answered with shells that tore entire trees out of the frozen ground. The sky pulsed with tracer fire, streaking red and white across the darkness. Infantry scrambled between craters, slipping on ice slick with mud and blood, shouting orders no one could hear over the roar of artillery. Explosions shook the earth so violently that even veterans felt their stomachs twist. In that chaos, German lines crumbled and entire companies were swallowed by smoke, flame, and panic. Asterisk as the Shermans pushed forward, the Germans counterattacked with everything they had left. MG-42 screamed from hidden nests, mowing through the snowy underbrush with terrifying precision. Mortar rounds burst overhead, showering the field with burning fragments of earth and ice. A Panzer IV lurched from behind a shattered barn, its first shot punching through an American half-track and sending metal shrapnel spinning across the frozen road. The blast knocked several soldiers to the ground, their ears ringing, vision blurring, senses swallowed by smoke. The battlefield had become a white inferno, where each breath stung like fire. The Americans answered in force. A column of Sherman tanks swung left, firing in rapid, thunderous succession until the air shook like fabric being torn apart. Their shells exploded against German armor, sending black smoke spiraling upward. Infantry sprinted beside the tanks, slipping on frost while trading bursts of rifle fire with German defenders retreating through the woods. The earth was a maze of craters, bodies, and splintered trees. Snow mixed with soot until everything looked the same sickening shade of gray. In the chaos, German squads began to fall back not in formation, but in desperation. Inside the collapsing defensive line, Lieutenant Krieger's platoon tried to hold the last ridge overlooking the valley. Men shouted over each other, their voices raw as they fed belt after belt into their machine gun. But the Americans kept coming steady, relentless, supported by armor that rolled forward like metal giants. A shell struck the ridge, throwing Kruger and several men to the ground. Snow blasted upward in a white cloud as the shockwave hammered their bodies. Kruger staggered to his feet only to see half his platoon already fleeing, abandoning rifles, helmets, and hope. When the final American push surged over the ridge, the German line shattered completely. Some soldiers dropped their weapons and ran into the forest, disappearing in the shadows thick with smoke. Others collapsed where they stood, too exhausted or wounded to continue. Kruger shouted for his men to regroup, but before he could finish the order, an explosion from a Sherman's main gun sent him sprawling into a ditch. Disoriented, bleeding, and half-blinded by dirt, he crawled toward the remnants of his platoon only to find them surrounded by American infantry with rifles trained but not firing. The battle was over. Surrender was the only path left. Asterisk as gunfire slowly faded into scattered echoes. The surviving Germans were rounded up in small trembling groups. The smoke hung low, drifting between shattered trees like a heavy curtain. Kruger lifted his hands, fingers numb from cold and blood loss, and stumbled forward with the others. No one resisted. They had nothing left to resist with. American soldiers moved cautiously, still scanning the tree line for hidden threats. One GI kicked away a discarded Panzerfaust. Another shouted for medics to check the wounded German and American alike. It was the first sign that the killing had finally stopped. Though fear still clung to the prisoners like a second skin, the POWs were ordered into a shallow depression in the snow-covered field, a spot once used by German mortar teams before the barrage overwhelmed them. Kruger counted maybe 40 survivors' boys with frostbitten fingers, veterans with hollow eyes, men missing helmets, gloves, and hope. An American sergeant pointed them toward the center, barking short commands. None of the prisoners understood the words, but the tone was clear: move and move now. As they trudged through the ice, several Germans exchanged terrified glances. They had seen pits like this before. They knew exactly what they feared. It meant rumors spread among the prisoners as quickly as frost across metal. Someone whispered that the Americans had been overwhelmed by POW numbers earlier in the campaign. Another claimed executions were already happening near the river. The youngest soldier, a boy barely 17, clutched his torn coat so tightly his knuckles turned white. "They're clearing the wounded first," someone muttered, mistranslating a guard's gesture. Kruger tried to steady his breathing, but every instinct told him they were being positioned for something final. The distant thud of artillery only fed their panic, each boom rolling across the valley like a cruel countdown. When the Americans formed the line opposite the prisoners, rifles slung low but unmistakably ready, several Germans dropped to their knees. One man began praying under his breath, his voice breaking with each word. Another stared blankly at the snow, as if accepting that this frozen patch of earth would become his grave. Kruger forced himself to stand, though his legs trembled violently beneath him. He had survived the Eastern Front, the collapse of Aachen, and the retreat from the Rhine only to die unarmed and defeated in a nameless field. The humiliation was almost worse than the fear, but then something unexpected happened. Instead of raising their rifles, the Americans lowered them completely. The sergeant in front, a tall man with soot smeared across his face, stepped forward with both hands open, palms raised in a non-threatening gesture. His voice carried across the field, calm but firm, though the prisoners couldn't understand a single word. Moments later, two medics jogged over with satchels and blankets. Confusion rippled through the post. This wasn't an execution formation. It wasn't even a punishment detail. It was something none of them were prepared for: mercy, delivered in the cold silence after the battle's roar. The prisoners hesitated as the medics approached, unsure whether this was a trick or some new interrogation tactic. One GI knelt beside a wounded German corporal whose leg was wrapped with a blood-soaked rag. The medic gently removed the cloth, his brow furrowing with concern rather than hostility. He signaled for warm water and bandages, working quickly despite the frost biting at his own fingers. The Germans watched in disbelief. They had expected bitterness, even revenge, after the brutal clash that had just torn the valley apart. Yet the Americans acted with steady, practiced compassion like men exhausted by killing. Not eager for more. Nearby, a private handed out canteens, placing each one carefully into shaking hands instead of tossing them down. When a teenage POW dropped his cup from sheer exhaustion, the American simply picked it up, wiped the snow from its rim, and poured again. No shouting. No threats. Just quiet, efficient help. Kruger felt something twist in his chest. It wasn't gratitude, not yet, but a painful kind of realization. The war had taught them to expect cruelty from every direction, even their own commanders. But here, from the enemy they'd been taught to fear most, came unexpected gentleness. Further down the line, an American corporal approached with a wool blanket draped over his shoulder. He paused in front of an elderly German soldier whose helmet dangled uselessly from broken straps. The old man could barely stand. His breath came out in thin, trembling clouds. Without a word, the corporal wrapped the blanket over his shoulders and tightened it gently. The old man blinked several times, stunned. He had fought in the last war, survived wounds and winters far worse than this one. Yet nothing in his experience had prepared him for kindness from a man in enemy colors. As the medics continued their work, the sergeant studied the prisoners one by one, his expression firm but not hostile. He gave short orders to his men, gestures indicating food, water, warmth. The POWs slowly realized they weren't being prepared for execution, but for processing and medical care. Still, their fear clung stubbornly. Some flinched at sudden movements. Others stared at the ground as if expecting violence at any second. Kruger could feel the tension loosening inside the group, but it was a fragile, uncertain shift like ice cracking beneath. Cautious footsteps. Then came the moment that shattered the last of their expectations. An American mess truck rolled into the field, its engine coughing in the cold, and two cooks jumped out carrying large metal containers. The smell hit the prisoners first, thick, warm, unmistakably real. Soup, stew, something hearty enough to fill the stomach instead of taunting it. Several POWs turned away, overwhelmed. Hunger had been their constant companion for months. But receiving food from the enemy felt like stepping into a world where everything they had believed about this war no longer made sense. One by one, the Americans placed crates of tin cups along the snowbank and motioned for the prisoners to step forward. The guards kept their rifles down, barrels pointed at the slush instead of at trembling torsos. Kruger approached cautiously, each step feeling like it might trigger some unseen consequence. But when he reached the front, the cook simply ladled a full serving into his cup, giving a short nod before moving to the next man. Steam curled upward, warming Krieger's face. He hadn't smelled anything this comforting since before the war tore his life apart. The youngest, POW, a frostbitten cheek stared at his portion as if it were a hallucination. When he failed to lift the cup, still shaking from shock and cold, an American GI stepped beside him, guiding his hands gently. The boy flinched, expecting a blow, but the soldier remained patient. Slowly, the boy raised the cup to his lips. The first sip triggered a sob he couldn't contain. It wasn't loud, but it carried across the field, dissolving whatever resistance the others still held. Compassion, unexpected and unearned, broke them open. For the first time since the shooting stopped, Kruger allowed himself to look directly at the Americans. What he saw surprised him. These were not men celebrating victory or reveling in dominance. They were exhausted, bruised, hollow-eyed from nights without sleep soldiers who had lost friends in the same valley only hours before. Their mercy wasn't born from superiority. It was born from fatigue, humanity, and perhaps a simple desire to end the suffering where they could. In that small frozen field, the line between victor and vanquished blurred more than any of the prisoners expected. A medic approached Kruger next, tapping his shoulder and pointing to a cut above his eyebrow that had crusted with dirt and dried blood. Kruger stiffened, unsure whether to allow the touch, but the medic waited patiently, saying nothing. Eventually, Kruger nodded. The man cleaned the wound with warm water and wrapped a fresh bandage around his head. The gesture felt almost sacred, a quiet acknowledgement that he was no longer a target, no longer a threat, but a human being who deserved not to bleed out in the snow. It changed something deep inside him. As the sun dipped behind the shattered tree line, casting long shadows across the field, the Americans finished tending to the last of the prisoners. The POWs huddled together, not in fear now, but in stunned silence. The valley that had roared with tank fire and mortar blasts only hours earlier now held an unexpected peace. Kruger looked down at the cup warming his hands, then toward the Americans distributing blankets and rations with quiet efficiency. For the first time since the war began, he allowed himself to believe that survival might not be a punishment, but a second chance. The march to the temporary holding camp began under a sky still bruised with smoke. American guards walked alongside the post, rifles slung but not raised, their boots sinking into the half-melted snow left behind by the morning barrage. Kruger felt every step echo through the bruises on his ribs. The valley they crossed was littered with burned-out vehicles and shattered helmets, grim reminders of how violently the battle had ended. No one spoke, not the prisoners, not the guards. The only sound was the crunch of snow and the distant crackle of fires that refused to die. Somewhere in the line, a young German soldier stumbled, his legs buckling from cold and hunger. Before the other POWs could react, an American sergeant grabbed the boy's arm, steadying him with surprising care. The guard muttered something in English, offering his canteen. The boy hesitated, unsure whether to accept, until Kruger nodded subtly. The boy drank greedily, wiping his mouth with a trembling sleeve. The prisoners exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't the treatment they had been warned about. It was the kind of gesture that blurred the boundaries of war in ways none of them understood. As they continued walking, Kruger glanced at the American column advancing behind them. These weren't men celebrating victory. Their faces were drawn, hollowed by the same exhaustion and fear the Germans carried. One GI limped heavily, supported by two comrades, his bandaged arm hanging awkwardly. Another carried a folded jacket belonging to someone who clearly wasn't coming back. The realization hit Kruger with unexpected force. These men had lost brothers today. They were given mercy not because they were soft, but because they understood suffering in a way only soldiers did. When the group reached a fork in the frozen road, the Americans slowed the pace. Snow drifted from the branches above, falling in soft curtains that muffled the world into a cold silence. The road ahead ran past what remained of a farmhouse, its roof blown open, walls charred, windows shattered into jagged smiles. A German POW stopped walking, staring at it with pale disbelief. "My cousin lived here," he whispered. No one responded. The Americans urged them forward gently, avoiding the debris where toys, pots, and burned clothing were half buried beneath the ash. The temporary POW camp was nothing more than a ring of wire hastily erected around an open field. A few canvas tents flapped violently in the wind, supported by crook poles that looked ready to collapse. Smoke rose from a small cooking station, where American cooks stirred pots with wooden paddles. Kruger expected barking orders, harsh treatment, maybe even beatings. Instead, the guards directed the prisoners toward a sheltered area near the ridge. Their tone was firm but not cruel, their movements steady and controlled. A medic stood nearby, waiting for the wounded to step forward. Inside the perimeter, the Germans sat in clusters, their breath fogging in the air. Some stared at their hands, as though noticing them for the first time. Others gazed toward the tree line, perhaps imagining escape, though none attempted it. The memory of the battle still clung to them like smoke. Every explosion, every scream, every gunshot replayed behind their eyes. Kruger tried to calm the younger soldiers, telling them to rest, to conserve strength, but his voice trembled. He wasn't sure whether he spoke to them or to himself. A group of American engineers arrived carrying lumber and blankets. They set to work building simple windbreaks wooden walls to shield the camp from the biting air. The POWs watched silently, stunned that the enemy would build shelters for men who had tried to kill them only hours earlier. One engineer handed a blanket to an older German POW, whose hand shook too violently to grab it. He draped it over the man's shoulders, gave a quick nod, then returned to hammering boards. The old man wept quietly, turning his face away so no one would see Dot as dusk settled. The Americans lit lanterns along the camp perimeter. Their warm glow contrasted sharply with the cold metal of rifles resting against wooden posts. Kruger noticed one guard staring into the distance with a haunted expression. The man wasn't watching for escape attempts. He was remembering. Kruger recognized that look. It was the face of someone who had buried a friend only hours before. The kind of grief that didn't need a shared language to be understood. For a moment, the line between captor and captive dissolved into the same heavy silence. Not long after, the Americans began distributing rations, brown paper-wrapped bricks of war food most Poles had never seen before. Some prisoners unwrapped them hesitantly, half expecting the contents to be inedible. Instead, they found biscuits, dried meat, and even small chocolate bars. The younger Poles devoured theirs instantly, while others ate slowly, savoring the strange sweetness of American chocolate, as if it were something sacred. Kruger let a piece melt on his tongue. It tasted like a memory he thought he had lost, a reminder of life before the war demanded everything Dot after eating. The prisoners were allowed to sit near a small fire pit while the guards maintained watch from a respectful distance. Sparks drifted into the night sky, dissolving into the snow-laden wind. One American sat with his back to the flames, cleaning his rifle with slow, methodical movements. The firelight revealed a jagged cut on his cheek, probably from a blast earlier. When he caught Kruger looking, he simply nodded, not in mockery, but acknowledgement. Two soldiers who had tried to kill each other, now sharing the same warmth in the same frozen night. As the wind grew stronger, the Poles huddled tighter around the pit. A teenage German soldier pointed upward when a formation of American bombers roared across the darkening sky, heading east. Their engines vibrated through the ground, shaking loose snow from the trees. The boy flinched, instinctively ducking. Kruger placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. "The war moves forward," he murmured. One American overheard him and gave a faint, tired smile. They all knew the bombers meant another city, another battlefield, would feel the same fire they had survived that morning. Later, an American lieutenant approached the prisoners with a clipboard, accompanied by an interpreter. He instructed the POWs to give their names, ranks, and units. The procedure was quick, pragmatic, and free of intimidation. When the lieutenant reached Kruger, he studied him briefly before asking if he had any wounded who needed immediate attention. Kruger hesitated, then pointed to two men shivering violently. The lieutenant signaled medics, and the prisoners were escorted to a warmer tent. It was another gesture that unsettled the Germans, not because it frightened them, but because it didn't. When the roll call ended, the lieutenant spoke with the interpreter for a long moment before stepping closer to the campfire. "This war is ending soon," the interpreter translated. "No one needs to die tonight." The words carried through the cold air, settling heavily over the group. Some POWs lowered their heads, others stared blankly into the flames. The idea of survival, real survival, felt foreign. War had conditioned them to expect suffering, not safety. Yet the Americans spoke with a calm certainty that made hope seem possible, even if they didn't fully trust it. As night deepened, the guards rotated shifts. One young American stood near the entrance, wrapping his coat tighter as the wind howled through the valley. Kruger watched him shiver and suddenly noticed how thin the soldier's gloves were. For a moment, he felt a strange impulse and urge to speak, to offer something human. But he had nothing to give, and even if he did, the language barrier caused a gulf between them. The guard caught Kruger's gaze briefly before returning his focus to the forest, as if unwilling to acknowledge their shared vulnerability. A distant explosion lit up the horizon, an orange flash framed by dark clouds. The POWs tensed immediately, but the Americans remained calm. "Artillery far off," one guard explained, tapping his helmet. The reassurance helped little. For months, explosions had meant only one thing to the Germans: death was near. Kruger felt the old fear rise again, twisting through his chest. But when he looked around, he noticed the guards scanning the field not with suspicion, but with protectiveness. As if defending the prisoners from dangers still lurking beyond the wire, snow began to fall in thick, slow flakes that softened the contours of the ruined valley. The camp grew quiet, lit only by dim lanterns and the dying glow of fires. Some prisoners leaned against each other to sleep. Others fought exhaustion, unwilling to let their guard down. Kruger sat awake, listening to the wind carry faint echoes of distant fighting. He thought of the battle, the men he'd lost, the moments that could have ended him. Yet here he was, alive, kept warm by the very people he had feared would kill him. Not far away, a group of American soldiers sat in their own circle, passing around a dented tin of cigarettes. Their laughter was muted, brittle, the kind of laughter used to push back the weight of grief. One soldier pulled a photo from his pocket, a woman holding a newborn, and stared at it with an expression Kruger recognized instantly. It was longing mixed with dread. Kruger wondered if he would ever hold his own family again, or if the war had already stolen that future. For the first time, he saw the Americans not as enemies, but as mirrors. A medic approached the campfire once more, checking on the older prisoners. When he reached Kruger, he gently lifted the bandage on his head, inspecting it under lantern light. His touch was careful, almost delicate. "You'll be fine," he murmured, even though Kruger understood only the tone. The warmth in the medic's voice reminded him of the army doctor back home, who had stitched him up after a farming accident years before. For a moment, the war disappeared, replaced by a memory of a simpler life. It was almost painful to feel something human again. A German POW began coughing violently, collapsing onto his knees. Immediately, two American guards rushed forward, lifting him by the arms and calling for the medic. The man was carried to a heated tent while the prisoners watched in stunned silence. "They're treating him like one of their own," someone whispered. Another replied, "Maybe they don't see enemies anymore." Kruger wasn't sure. He only knew that the Americans were acting in ways none of them expected. Instead of fear, a quiet, cautious respect began to replace the tension that had ruled their lives since surrender. As midnight approached, the valley finally settled into uneasy stillness. The POWs curled beneath blankets, their bodies slowly thawing after weeks of cold, hunger, and terror. Guards paced the perimeter, boots crunching softly in the snow. Kruger stared into the dying flames, feeling the weight of the day pressing against him. A battle had raged that morning, a brutal clash of steel, smoke, and shattered men. Now, in its aftermath, mercy had appeared in places he never thought possible. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to close his eyes without fear of not waking again. Morning came slowly, dragging a pale gray light across the valley. The POW camp looked eerily peaceful beneath a thin bed of fresh snow, though the air still carried the metallic scent of spent shells and scorched wood. Kruger awoke stiff and disoriented, his blanket crusted with frost. Around him, prisoners stirred with groans and shivers, their bodies not yet convinced the nightmare of the previous day had truly ended. American guards stood by the perimeter, stamping their boots to keep warm. None looked hostile. Instead, they watched with weary vigilance, as though waiting for a day that refused to begin. As the sun climbed, faint warmth touched the camp, revealing faces that had aged years overnight. Some POWs sat upright, clutching their cups, unwilling to let go of the only warm object they had felt in weeks. Others wiped their eyes discreetly, pretending it was only the wind. Kruger noticed the young American medic from the night before checking supplies, his hands moving with the practiced rhythm of someone who had spent too many months tending wounds instead of living life. Their eyes met briefly in unspoken acknowledgement that both had survived something deeply scarring. Breakfast was nothing more than thin oatmeal served in battered cups. But the prisoners accepted it with reverence usually reserved for sacred offerings. While they ate, a convoy of American vehicles rumbled through the nearby road jeeps, ambulances, and a single tank limping along with a damaged tread. The noise startled several POWs, triggering leftover reflexes from the battle. One man dove instinctively for cover before realizing he was safe. The guards paused their duties, watching with faces that showed they understood. Fear had become a muscle memory, one that men from both sides shared. Later, the American lieutenant from the previous evening returned with a clipboard, gathering additional information from the prisoners. Even with an interpreter, the process moved slowly. Some Germans struggled to recall their units after chaotic retreats. Others hesitated, unsure whether honesty was safe. Kruger answered carefully, giving details he hoped would not endanger anyone. The lieutenant nodded politely, his expression unreadable. He seemed neither cruel nor sympathetic, simply exhausted. It struck Kruger that officers, too, carried burdens invisible to those under their command. After roll call, the prisoners were instructed to help clear a section of the field for incoming wounded. The order caused tension. Many POWs feared they were being used as forced labor. But the Americans quickly clarified through gestures that it was voluntary, not mandatory. Several Germans stepped forward, including Kruger, who felt an unexpected urge to be useful. Together with American engineers, they removed debris, arranged space for stretchers, and shoveled snow to widen the paths. The cooperation felt awkward at first, but soon became practical necessity survival work, not ideological. During the cleanup, one German soldier froze at the sight of a burned helmet half buried in snow. Its insignia was barely visible, but enough to reveal it belonged to a comrade lost in the battle. He reached for it with trembling hands, tears spilling unchecked. An American guard knelt beside him, helping lift the helmet with care. The soldier whispered a name, and the guard simply nodded, as though paying respect. In that moment, grief dissolved the last remnants of division. They were no longer enemies, just men mourning different pieces of the same war. As noon approached, a group of American soldiers delivered additional blankets, though their own supplies seemed limited. One guard handed Kruger a thick woolen one with holes along the edges. "Better than freezing," the interpreter translated with a faint smile. Kruger accepted it, surprised by the warmth not just of the fabric, but of the gesture itself. Around him, Other posts received similar items, the camp slowly transforming from a cold holding pen into a semblance of temporary refuge. Small acts of mercy accumulated like slowly falling snow. Not everyone accepted the situation so easily. A hardened veteran named Bauer, gray-haired, rigid in posture, refused food and blankets. He sat apart from the others, arms crossed tightly, insisting the Americans were trying to weaken them for interrogation. When a guard approached to offer water, Bauer shouted in rough English, "We don't need your pity." The guard stepped back, hands raised, not wanting conflict. Kruger watched with a heavy heart. War had carved deep lines in the Bauer spirit, scars that mercy could not immediately reach. Not everyone could surrender fear as easily as a weapon. Eventually, snowfall thickened again, sweeping across the camp in slow sweeping waves. The prisoners huddled closer to their shelters, their breath rising in pale clouds. A few Americans built another fire pit and invited the POWs near it, motioning without words. Some accepted cautiously, warming their hands beside men they once tried to kill. The silence that settled over the circle felt almost wholly an unspoken agreement that, for now, violence had no place in this patch of winter. While sitting near the fire, Kruger overheard one American talking quietly to another, voice cracking with grief. Though he didn't understand the words, he recognized the tone immediately. Mourning. The soldier held a dog tag tightly, rubbing the engraved letters with his thumb. His friend placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. Kruger looked away, realizing that behind every rifle and uniform was a human being just as wounded as he was. It was a truth that propaganda had stolen from both sides, now revealed in the simple vulnerability of shared loss. Soon after, a medic returned to check the prisoners again, carrying a pot of warm water and fresh bandages. He approached them with the same patience as the night before. When he reached a soldier with frostbitten fingers, he warmed the man's hands between his own before applying ointment. The POW winced, expecting aggression, but the medic only spoke softly. Other prisoners watched in a mixture of confusion and awe. Kindness had become its own strange battlefield, one the Germans had never been trained to navigate. Just beyond the wire, another American squad passed carrying a stretcher with a wounded GI. His face was pale, lips trembling, eyes half open as snowflakes gathered on his eyelashes. The POWs instinctively stepped back, unsure whether they were allowed to watch. But the guard said nothing. One German whispered a prayer under his breath, and another removed his cap in respect. The stretcher team, though exhausted, nodded subtly in acknowledgement. In that single exchange, the invisible wall between captors and captives thinned even further. Later in the afternoon, the lieutenant gathered a small group of POWs and asked, through the interpreter, if any had medical experience. Two stepped forward, a former field nurse and an apprentice physician. They were escorted to the triage tent to assist with treating wounded Americans and prisoners alike. Kruger watched as they disappeared into the canvas structure, unsure whether to feel pride or fear. But the guards' expressions remained calm. This wasn't coercion. It was necessity. The war had reduced everyone to the same simple objective: keep the wounded alive. The sight of German POWs helping American medics spread through the camp like a quiet shock. Some prisoners viewed it as betrayal, others as redemption. For the Americans, it was practical cooperation. For Kruger, it was something else entirely. He saw men reclaiming pieces of themselves that the war had stripped away: compassion, dignity, purpose. When one of the POW medics returned for more supplies, several prisoners gathered around him, desperate for news of their wounded comrade in the heated tent. His calm reassurances eased tensions more effectively than any guard could. As daylight faded, the valley turned colder, the temperature dropping sharply. Guards distributed firewood, and one even demonstrated how to build a windbreak efficiently. Bauer, still stubborn, finally accepted a blanket when his hands began shaking uncontrollably. Another POW shared part of his ration with him, breaking the silence between them. In this fragile moment, Kruger realized that captivity had created a strange new community, a place where survival depended, not on rank or ideology, but on simple human collaboration. It felt unfamiliar, but oddly comforting. By evening, the harsh wind forced everyone closer to the fires. The POWs and American guards formed loose circles, separated by only a few feet of snow. A guard began telling a story to his fellow soldiers, and though the POWs couldn't understand the words, his animated gestures made them grin. A few Germans shared hesitant chuckles, careful not to seem too comfortable. War had made laughter a rare commodity, but in that moment, it felt like a small rebellion against despair. The interpreter eventually approached, explaining the camp would soon receive orders about transferring the POWs to a larger facility. Some prisoners stiffened, fearing harsher treatment elsewhere. But others, like Kruger, assumed nothing could be worse than the front they had escaped. When someone asked whether they would remain together, the interpreter shrugged. War had never made promises about continuity. Kruger felt unease settle over him, but also a quiet acceptance. Whatever came next, he would face it alive, and that alone felt miraculous. Before lights out, the Americans provided extra firewood and instructed the prisoners to stay warm through the night. One guard offered Kruger a second blanket, explaining through gestures that he'd earned it today. Kruger accepted hesitantly, unsure how to respond. The guard smiled, just a quick, tired curve of the lips before returning to his post. It was a small gesture, but it chipped away at the wall inside Kruger's chest. The one built from years of fear, orders, and blind obedience. As the camp settled into silence, Kruger lay awake beneath both blankets, staring up at the sky. Snowflakes drifted gently, catching what little moonlight seeped through the clouds. He thought of the morning's battle, the explosions, the screams, the blinding flashes that nearly erased him. And he thought of the unexpected mercy that followed. How strange, he mused, that the same hands that fired shells hours ago now offered warmth, food, and medical care. For the first time, he realized how deeply the war had twisted his expectations of humanity. Just before sleep claimed him, Kruger heard one of the younger POWs whisper, "Do you think they will keep us safe?" Another replied softly, "Today they did." Kruger closed his eyes, letting those simple words anchor him. Safety had become a fragile, uncertain thing, impossible to trust, yet impossible to ignore. As the wind howled across the snow-covered valley, he understood that this moment, however fleeting, was a turning point. The war was still roaring somewhere beyond the hills. But here, in this improvised camp, humanity had briefly taken its place. Before dawn, the camp stirred with a different kind of tension, quiet, tight, expectant. Kruger sensed it immediately, a heaviness in the air thicker than smoke. Boots crunched through the snow as new vehicles rolled in, their engines rumbling with authority. American MPs stepped out first, uniforms crisp despite the cold. Behind them came a senior officer, his posture rigid, eyes sharp as he surveyed the camp like a man evaluating damaged property. The prisoners stood in uneasy silence. This morning, something would change. Everyone felt it long before anyone spoke. The officer introduced himself as Colonel Harper, though his expression suggested he expected no questions and tolerated no delays. With a curt gesture, he ordered the guards to assemble the prisoners for inspection. Kruger lined up with the others, breath fogging in the cold, aware that the fragile trust built over the past 2 days hung by a thread. Harper walked the line slowly, scrutinizing faces with a cold, appraising gaze. When he paused in front of a young POW trembling visibly, the entire formation stiffened, waiting for the verdict in his silence. Beside Harper stood Lieutenant Walker, the same exhausted but empathetic officer who had overseen the prisoners earlier. The contrast between the two men was stark. Walker's eyes held recognition, memory, understanding. Harper's held calculation. When the colonel barked for identification papers, the interpreter hurried to translate, and POWs fumbled through pockets and torn coats. Snow drifted lightly across their shoulders as the colonel skimmed each document, his face tightening whenever he encountered missing information. To him, even wounds and exhaustion looked like potential deceit. When Harper reached, Bauer, the hardened veteran who had refused blankets, he stopped. Bauer's posture remained defiant, chin lifted high despite the cold seeping into his bones. Harper questioned him sharply, tone clipped and suspicious. Bauer replied in short, tense phrases through the interpreter, offering neither apology nor explanation. For a moment it seemed the colonel might order him removed. Walker stepped forward subtly, clearing his throat, reminding Harper of Geneva guidelines with carefully chosen words. The colonel relented, though his glare lingered like a shadow cast across the snow. After the inspection, Harper announced that the POWs would be transferred within the hour to a larger holding facility. Fear rippled through the group like wind passing through brittle grass. Many prisoners had finally begun to feel fragile safety here, and the thought of losing it, of being thrust back into the unknown, was paralyzing. Walker instructed the interpreter to reassure them that they would remain together, but even he could not mask the uncertainty. Kruger clenched his fists inside torn gloves, trying to anchor himself against the rising tide of dread. The prisoners were ordered to pack what little they had. Kruger folded his blankets carefully, treating them as precious relics rather than standard-issue fabric. Around him, men tucked away small keepsakes, buttons from uniforms, scraps of letters, even bits of broken helmets. These items, worthless to most, were lifelines to identity. As they moved toward the loading area, the camp felt strangely hollow. The fire smoldered quietly. Lanterns flickered inside tents. The valley that had briefly become a refuge now felt like a place about to vanish from existence. While the prisoners gathered, Walker approached Harper with a folder he had retrieved from headquarters. Snow dusted its cover as he handed it over. "These were forwarded from Remagen Command," he said. Harper opened the file impatiently, flipping through names, assignments, and wartime records. His expression shifted subtly, disbelief first, then something bordering on discomfort. Several prisoners, including Kruger, had been listed not as combatants, but as repurposed labor units drafted in the final chaotic months. Many had never fired a weapon. The revelation hung heavily between the officers. Harper closed the file slowly, jaw tightening as though swallowing a bitter pill. His rigid posture wavered for the briefest moment. Walker used that crack to speak. "They're not what we thought," he said quietly. "Some were barely soldiers." Harper glanced toward the line of POWs, their faces drawn and weary. For the first time, uncertainty entered his eyes. But procedure was procedure. "They're still prisoners," he muttered, though with less conviction. Walker nodded but didn't break eye contact, silently challenging him to see the men, not the accusations attached to them. The prisoners were herded toward the truck's open beds lined with wooden benches, cold metal glinting beneath layers of frost. Kruger climbed the board, gripping the rails as an MP secured the tarp over them. Bauer sat beside him, arms folded, his breath shaking. "Where do you think they're taking us?" he whispered. Kruger didn't answer, not because he didn't know, but because he feared his guess was correct. A facility deeper inland, farther from battle lines, where rules tightened and mercy thin. Before departure, one American guard rushed forward, carrying a small canvas bag. He approached the truck awkwardly, checking over his shoulder as if afraid of reprimand. "For you," he said, pressing the bag into Kruger's hands. Inside were a pair of thicker gloves, a small tin of coffee powder, and a folded photo of an American soldier smiling with his family. The gesture stunned Kruger. The guard tapped his chest as if to say, "We're human too," then stepped back into formation. Harper watched the exchange silently but said nothing. Engines roared to life, sending vibrations through the wooden floorboards. Snow whipped across the valley as the convoy prepared to leave. Walker approached the truck, looking genuinely conflicted. He raised his voice over the noise. "You'll be treated fairly," he assured them, though he couldn't guarantee it. The interpreter translated, but the words did little to ease the tension. Still, Kruger found comfort in Walker's presence. In this landscape of uniforms and orders, Walker remained one of the few who looked at them without judgment. The trucks lurched forward, rolling over uneven ice that cracked beneath their weight. As the camp shrank behind them, prisoners pressed toward the openings of the tarp, watching with bittersweet eyes. It had been a place of fear, and yet a place where kindness blossomed unexpectedly. Smoke curled from the final fire pit, rising like a farewell signal into the cold morning. Kruger wondered whether they would ever see such mercy again, or whether this brief interlude was merely an anomaly in the brutality of war. The convoy followed a narrow mountain road, weaving between frozen pines and shattered fan houses. Occasionally, they passed the wreckage of burned-out tanks, reminding the prisoners how close they had come to death. Bowers shivered beside Kruger, not from cold but from memory. "I saw my whole unit fall in minutes," he murmured. "I thought I would join them." Kruger nodded silently. The landscape outside felt haunted, every ruined structure echoing with lives displaced or destroyed. The war had devoured entire worlds, leaving only fragments behind. A sudden jolt shook the truck as it hit a deep rut, causing several POWs to grab the side rails for balance. The MP riding with them steadied himself, then gave a reassuring nod. Despite strict posture, his eyes reflected genuine concern. He tapped the roof twice, signaling the driver to slow down. Small gestures, but they mattered. The Americans weren't rough or careless, they were careful, mindful. It was strange how quickly the POWs recognized and appreciated these subtleties. Midway through the journey, the convoy halted near a makeshift medical checkpoint, where American medics tend the wounded from a nearby skirmish. The air filled with distant artillery echoes, though far enough not to threaten the convoy directly. Kruger watched medics rushing between patients, their hands stained with mud and blood. A stretcher team passed close by, carrying a young GI with a bandaged torso. His face twisted in pain, yet his eyes softened when he noticed the POWs watching. He nodded at them, a gesture of acknowledgement, not resentment. While the trucks idled, a medic approached the POW truck and offered water to anyone who needed it. Bauer hesitated, but finally accepted, his voice barely audible as he whispered "Danke." The medic smiled gently. In that moment, the barriers between them, uniforms, orders, propaganda, seemed to dissolve. The medic moved on, unaware of how profoundly he had affected the prisoners. To men who had braced for cruelty, kindness felt almost overwhelming. As the convoy resumed, snow began falling harder, turning the world into a swirling white curtain. Visibility narrowed. The prisoners tightened their grip on the benches, the truck swaying slightly as it navigated icy curves. Kruger stared out through a flap in the tarp, watching the blurred shapes of forests and ruined barns rush past. He felt a strange blend of fear and relief. Whatever lay ahead, he was leaving battle behind. The war had taken enough from him. He refused to let it take his remaining humanity. Hours later, the truck slowed as a larger, more fortified facility emerged from the fog-tall fences, guard towers, and multiple layers of checkpoints. This was no temporary holding camp. Krieger's stomach tightened. Around him, the POWs straightened, bracing for whatever awaited. Yet the guards did not shout or brandish weapons. Instead, they guided them calmly, processing them with efficient order. It felt clinical, detached, but not cruel. A different world from the front lines, neither sanctuary nor battlefield. During intake, Walker appeared again, speaking with the facility officers, occasionally glancing toward the POWs as paperwork changed hands. Kruger watched the exchange with cautious hope. He didn't know what Walker was saying, but the lieutenant's gestures suggested advocacy. After a brief discussion, one officer gave a nod of approval. Walker approached the POW group afterward. "You'll stay together," he said, voice steady. Relief rippled quietly through the prisoners' fragile, but real. As the gates closed behind them, night settled over the compound, bringing with it a cold stillness. Kruger sat on a wooden bunk, blankets draped around him, listening to the distant hum of generators and the muffled footsteps of guards. For the first time since the battle, he felt a cautious sense of future uncertain but possible. He gazed through the barred window at the falling snow, letting the quiet wash over him. Captivity was still captivity, but the brutality he had feared never arrived. Instead, he found something unexpected, the faint outline of hope in a world torn apart.